and it's great to see that so many people have been able to jump in, which is excellent. So yeah, we really appreciate that. So today is going to be focused on a exciting new thing that we're introducing at Preston. That's the growth progress reports. So we're going to unpack those reports today, each component of it, and also run through some suggested questions that you can use to prompt some discussion at home about it, which hopefully you should find useful, as well as a chance for some questions. All right. So before we start, I wanted to do an acknowledgement of country. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay respects to the 5 tribes of the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to the elders of the community and extend our recognition to their descendants. Okay, so let's start off with the big question: what are growth progress reports? So at Preston, we have an unrelenting focus on learner growth. So this means we understand where our students currently are with their learning and what they need to do next to grow. Our students understand this too. And these reports that we've put together capture all of those elements of learners and maps it out in a way where we can clearly see where their growth is occurring or perhaps not occurring. So we've got a couple of key components to this report. So we've got a summation of growth habits over time, attendance and punctuality, organisation, Victorian curriculum achievement levels, and learner progress on assessment. So let's have a look at the visualisation of this. Before we do that, though, an important reminder here that at any time, because we use continuous reporting here at Preston, you're able to access this information on Compass. So on your student's profile, you've got the dashboard where you can see any Chronicle entries that have popped up there, so student awards or any other pertinent Chronicle posts. We've got the schedule where, of course, you can see their timetable. We've got the learner progress from assessment and homework. So most parents are using this function already, but you can see the sorts of results that students are getting or any outstanding learning tasks. So really useful place if you're not using it already. Attendance is already summarized for you there, so you can see whether or not they're missing sessions that you're not aware of. And lastly, reports. This is where you go to access the report that we're talking about today, as well as our standard report, which we're required to do by the department. So let's look at this new report that we've got here. So you can see basically we're taking all that information and putting it into a neat little PDF where you can see it in a visual fashion. Each of those individual tabs can be challenging to navigate, especially in our busy lives. So we're hoping that this summary will make it a lot easier to discuss at home and to provide that support that all students need. So let's have a look at how to read the report now. So you can see here, this is a sample report. Hopefully you've been able to download your own student's report at home and had a bit of a look at it. So you can see here, the first component is the growth habits. So as you should be aware, each term we give you a summation of the student's progress on growth habits. But in this nice little visualized version of it, you can see how the student is growing over time, or perhaps dipping if there's been a bit of a decline. We've got it presented in a nice visual fashion, so with the expected level mapped out in the dotted line. Victorian curriculum, we've got here a summation of how they've gone with their Victorian curriculum achievement levels, again, against the expected level. And again, they should be growing over time. Learner progress, really useful component of this report, a little summation of the average result that the students got on every one of their learning tasks. We've got the learning task submission rate, which is a great recognition of how organized your child is, how they gone with submitting learning tasks on time. And then lastly, we've got a clear documentation here of their lateness and attendance. So growth habits, you should hopefully be aware that at Preston High, We value a couple of key, learning dispositions that are useful for a student. And we've got, resourcefulness, collaborative, reflective, and attitude to learning. These are our four main ones, and you can see here how it's mapped out for this student. We've got every term mapped out. We've got an interesting journey for this particular student. You can see that they were doing very well, sort of up until term 2 of year 8. We had them above the expected level. Took a bit of a dip there in terms 3, 4, and 1, and then recovered, term 2, year 9. And it's interesting. I mean, this basically perfectly matches the lockdowns that were occurring. So this is really interesting. You can see just a really clear visual summary of how this student's going with their growth habits. So yeah, good one to look at home. Lateness and attendance, you can see here we've got a summation of this. Now, it's really important to note that the school attendance here is measured in a fairly black and white way. It is just purely the number of times that the student was actually at school. School-related absences are accounted for. So if a student was away because they were on sport, that doesn't lower their attendance. However, if a student was away sick, it does. Now, the reason we've done this is we wanted families to be able to see, where dips in attendance were happening, even if it was from a legitimate reason like illnesses, to perhaps make connections and see, okay, well, this dip occurred in term 2 of year 10, and what do you know, we've seen a dip in their academic performance, and this is, pretty normal, but it does help contextualize the broader growth data. And, obviously attending classes on time is a really important part of being, productive and responsible adults. So getting a nice visualization of whether or not a student is timely to class is also really useful. Victorian curriculum levels, our entire curriculum is mapped out according to the Victorian curriculum, and we measure throughout our summative tasks, our milestones, and our observations in class, a student's performance at the expected levels on Victorian curriculum. You would get these regularly, you would have seen it in primary school on the reports, and you've certainly seen it here at Preston High. But now with this growth progress report, we've got it summarized across time. So you can see that journey of where they're either meeting the expected level or perhaps below it. So this is, a useful way of articulating whether or not a student has been able to demonstrate those expected levels. Learning task submission rate is a nice visual summary of whether or not a student is submitting their learning tasks on time. This encapsulates all learning tasks, not just the big summative ones. So this includes smaller tasks that a teacher may have set for homework. It also includes milestones. And it's, again, a really good predictor of whether or not a student is able to manage themselves and organize themselves well. So again, another really good way of, gauging how organized your child is. It's really important these things are submitted on time so students can get feedback in order to improve before summative tasks. This is something that, students do really need to prioritize, and you will see ebbs and flows for most of your children. And that'll give you, I guess, an idea of times where they may have been slipping in their organization. So this one here is basically a summation of how students have gone on all of their learning tasks. So we've compiled every single summative learning task that the student has done. This is the big task at the end of a unit. And, you should be familiar with the language that we use at Preston High by now. Working at is a student who's working at the expected level. Anything above that, they're obviously achieving something beyond the expected level, and anything below, they're not at that expected level. So you can see that this student's journey has generally been one where they're, sort of meeting the expected level, but we've had some slight dips. You can see that at the start of year 9, they had a bit of a dip, and at the start of year 10, they've had a bit of a dip. So this is, I guess, again, a thing that you can discuss with your child at home. What was happening in this semester? Was there anything we could have done to support, or is there anything you need to ask your teachers about? This is, I guess, a way of springboarding those kind of conversations. So again, just that expected level, are they at the expected level of Victorian curriculum? So it closely relates to the other data that you've seen elsewhere. Okay, so that's the basic run through of the report and what it means. What we wanted to do now is to look at some ways that this can be discussed at home. So this may be a useful one for you to take a little screenshot of, or a photo with using your phone. We've got some suggested questions here that you could ask. Starting off with just a general question and make your child kind of consider the data themselves. Ask them what trends they can observe. Do they notice certain periods of time where things went down? And then a really useful question is asking them about the connections between the data. Do they notice any kind of pattern? Like when their attendance goes down, do their results go down? Do they notice any pattern with lateness? Do they notice any issues with their submission rates? If submission rates are low, are their results lower as well? So those are good things for your child to think about, because it'll help them make the connection between things like their attendance and their organization and their academic performance. Okay, so I think it's also worth asking them, have there been any kind of differences in their learner progress statements? So what basically have they noticed? Were there any kind of things that were happening outside of themselves, like external factors that could be influencing it, maybe social things in the class, or maybe something as simple as moving home? But then also getting to reflect internally. So what things were happening within themselves that might have influenced their results? Were they perhaps experiencing low motivation or feeling overwhelmed? And lastly, just asking that question, what can be done to support? If there's support that you can provide at home, then I'm sure this would be something that would be appreciated by your child, and they may not ask for it on their own. And this data could be that point where they may actually ask for some additional form of support, or it could be a matter of encouraging them to seek further support at school. Teachers at Preston High are extremely open and supportive, but there's perhaps some students who don't feel too comfortable asking for that sort of support, and with the right nudge from home, maybe that could be the tipping point to get them to have those conversations. So I guess at its core, what we're hoping this document will do is provide that neat summary, which will give you a clear idea of where your child is at, and we'll publish this term by term. And we hope that it will help form some of these conversations at home. Before we go over to questions, Rowan, was there anything you wanted to add before we do that?
No, thanks, Matt. I think you've done a very comprehensive job there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so opportunity here for any questions that people had. Just in the interest of trying to get through this nice and coherently, we'll use the chat function rather than the mics. So if you've got a question, fire away, and we can take it from there.
So hopefully everyone can see where the chat function is.
Yeah, just to the right-hand side. I'll double check that we definitely do have chat enabled. Okay, allow reactions. Okay, this looks fine. Yes, it is enabled. Okay, so all right, thanks, Beck. Um, yeah, okay, so I can totally relate to that. Those brick wall moments where the adolescent mind is a fascinating thing, and sometimes they cannot be super open with talking about these things. I think that conversations framed around support are better than ones that are accusatory. So I think like those guiding questions that we gave, where they're framed, in a way where it's like, what do you observe? Um, those kind of things aren't value laden, and might, bring about a better response. And then framing it around support, like what can we do to help, or what support could you seek at school? I'd hope that would elicit a bit more of a response from your child.
I think as well, Matt, trying to start off if the conversation doesn't go anywhere very quickly, trying to offer your own observations and maybe start with a positive. I really liked when you did this. It seems like you've done really well in term one and try and think yourself, oh, what was going on then? Oh, you were doing, your homework or your study at that time. Something, if you can find some positive to begin with, it might open up those doors to talk further about things.
Yeah, and points in your data that you can see where things were going well, like that's a great thing to kind of point out if you're really stuck. It's like, all right, well, it looks like term two was working really well for you. What was going on in term two that made it so good for you? Um, yeah, so I think good advice from Rowan there. Any other questions?
I guess for people whose children are in year 10, just a quick thing before we get on to Ben's question. This is obviously a 7 to 10 report, and with our first cohort of year 11s next year, we'll be looking at ways that we can do a similar type of thing if we feel it's going to be useful. But at the moment, it's a 7 to 10 thing. So Ben asks a question about submission of work. Is there a two-part process? The student submits the work and a teacher needs to confirm receiving this.
Yeah, so
sometimes it is. Yeah, sorry.
sorry. Yeah, so it depends, like Rowan was about to say. So if the task is submitted on Compass, automatically it's recognized as being submitted. If a teacher then opens the task and sees that it's not actually the task, they can then mark it as unsubmitted. That happens pretty rarely, though. The other situation is if the task is done hard copy and it's handed in to the teacher would then need to mark it off. Now, feedback I've received from some parents in the past is that occasionally teachers do forget to tick that off on Compass. If your child is reporting that, the simplest and clearest way of resolving that is just a quick email to the teacher, and that sort of just nips the problem in the bud. You can avoid any second guessing or around whether or not your child's handed in the task. Any other questions? Okay, so one from Sam there. So the average growth habits over time graph, is this based on the reports by each teacher each term? Yeah. So that is an average of every teacher's submission of growth habits for that particular term. So naturally, you'll have some differences, particularly for subjects that your child might really enjoy versus ones they don't enjoy so much. This will give you the averaged result.
We find that, yeah, the results between subjects don't often vary too much. So
True.
that average line gives you a fairly good overview of how they're traveling. And if you really wanted to, you could also look at the difference between, certain, maybe their attitude to learning is very high, but their reflectiveness needs some work. And reflection is usually to do with taking on board feedback and acting on that with their assessment.
Okay. Well, I guess sort of, oh, yep, one more question. Room changes, are these taken into consideration regarding lateness? Yep. So certainly a teacher is the person who's inputting the data. So the logical first step when a student arrives late is that they would ask, if something was wrong, or if I had a room change, I'd be more flexible with the marking of my role. It's not just this black and white response. So yeah, that is taken into consideration. Beck's question there: if growth habits have improved strongly over time, but performance against Victorian curriculum has stayed the same. Yeah, okay. So that's an interesting one. I think that, while growth habits are a good predictor of a student achieving academically, Victorian curriculum isn't the be all and end all measure of student achievement. I would encourage you to look at the other areas too. So certainly have a look at their results on their learning tasks. But it's something to continue to encourage. I think that if they're not necessarily getting the results straight away with high growth habits, it's something that will, over time pay off. I think like framing it in a way where it's helping prepare them for, VCE or even beyond, into the workforce is a good way of framing that.
I think the other thing to add there, Beck, as well, is to ask your child, like, obviously you're doing really well with your growth habits. How do you feel you're going in class? And if you want further information, you could probably get in contact with their teachers as well to try and find out if there's anything else, that they might need to work on, or any other contextual factors that you might need to know about. With the independent music lessons there, Mel, it's something that we have tried to address this year, and it's my understanding that that's been fixed. But if it hasn't, if you still feel like there's some attendance glitches with that, that's something we can certainly look into. There was an issue earlier this year, I believe, or it might have been last year, but it was recently, where the roles were set up incorrectly with the instrumental music program, and so that was resulting in some strange attendance data, but we believe that we've fixed that up. So maybe if you can shoot me an email if you believe that there's still some issues happening there for your child, and I can look into it for you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, it doesn't look like we've got any more questions coming through. Like I said, this session is recorded, so we'll be putting it up on our YouTube channel, and I'll send a link out to that through Compass.
Cassandra, with those there sometimes are glitches on reports, on attendance. Yeah, you're right. If you take it up with the relevant teacher, that would be good, or the head of cohort for your child. Sometimes with CRTs, there are some human error that happens from time to time, but yeah, if you take it up with the head of cohort, we do try and particularly with the submission data, we've done a lot of work this year with our academic heads of cohort, and with Matt coming on as the academic growth leader, to make sure that that data is accurate, and that we're not just having all data look like worse than it actually is with regards to teachers not ticking submissions off and things like that. So that's certainly things that we're working on, because we understand that if we're publishing these things, we want it to be as accurate as possible. So we do try our best to keep on top of these things, and we're trying to improve some of our processes as we go. But if you find that there's an anomaly, please just do get in contact with your relevant head of cohort or your head of school.
Yeah, so that feedback there on the task feedback not being available, that's certainly something we can look into. We try to make as much of the feedback available as possible, but uh, gaining it all in a way which is accessible on campus is challenging. So yeah, striking the right balance between making the feedback available to the student, teacher workload, and the whole thing encompassed there is challenging. But yeah, we do try to make it as available as we can.
But Zelia or Zelaya, my apologies if I've mispronounced your name. If you believe that there's feedback missing from a learning task, again, I would get in contact with your child's classroom teacher. I'm not sure what the reason might be for that, but any summative or any assessment task, so they're the orange ones in Compass, they should have a learner progress statement. So that's, working at or some of those other statements, and they should have some feedback there and an attached rubric. So if you're not seeing some of those things on those assessment tasks, then get in contact with your child's teacher. There must have been some sort of error happening there.
Um, okay, well, thanks so much for all your questions. If there's anything else that you think about afterwards that you'd like to learn more about, or just had some last bits of feedback to provide, certainly get in touch with either myself or Rowan. And yeah, thank you again for your attendance at this really busy time of year.